Hi everyone, in this video I want to do a quick guide for Warhammer 3 covering the 3 High Elf Lord options, the differences between them, and which one I think is best for you to use when leading your armies. Now to start off with, the 3 Lord options the High Elves get are Archmages, which are their spellcasters, and then you have Princes and Princesses, which are 2 Combat Lords. Now for these, I want to start with comparing the Princes and the Princesses, because they're much more similar to each other, and then we'll see how they stack up against the Archmages. So to start off with, the main difference between these 2 Combat Lords is just that the Princesses have a ranged weapon and the Princes don't, but to compensate for that, they're slightly better in melee. Other than that, they're very similar. They even get basically the same selection of mounts, although the Princess does have a slight advantage because they get the Moon Dragon instead of the Sun Dragon, and the Moon Dragon hits a bit harder, as you can see. It's 520 instead of 460. And then also, weirdly, they also get their horse earlier. So you see the Princes get it at rank 7, but the Princesses only need to wait until rank 4. So they can get it much quicker. Well, not much quicker, but a little quicker, which is nice, but again, not a huge deal. So they have the slight advantage in mount options. But then when it comes to their ranged attack, I think this is actually pretty mediocre. As you can see in the little tooltip here, it doesn't have any sort of like AoE or explosive effect. So it's pretty weak when dealing with infantry or even like cavalry, because there are just too many men in the unit for it to effectively handle. And then even against a lot of like lords and heroes, single entities like that, it can also be pretty weak because the AP is very low. And most lords will have a lot of armor, so it can struggle to do a lot of damage much of the time. One thing is worth mentioning though, is that it can actually fire while moving in all directions, while they're mounted on the horse, and I believe the Great Eagle as well. But once you get them on the Griffin or the Dragon, they can only fire in a forward-facing arc, which they can still shoot while moving while they're doing that, but it makes them a bit less effective and kind of lowers their DPS a little further. Now, because the ranged attack is sort of mediocre, I think that also means that the Prince tends to have a better yellow line here than the Princess does, because you'll see a lot of the buffs here are taken up with stuff that increases their ranged damage, ending with this like volley of high arrows here, which is just a magic missile attack. And the Prince, instead of that, gets a bunch of straight line melee buffs. In particular, they get like 2 melee defense nodes here, which in general, I think the 24 melee defense you'd get from this is a lot stronger than trying to buff up a pretty like average middle of the road missile attack. Worth mentioning though is that the difference in their stats in melee, so you can see to start off with the Prince gets more armor, much more melee defense for a bit less melee attack, but that difference gets a lot worse once you start getting the monstrous mounts. So especially once you get to the Griffin and the Dragons, because at that point it's more the stats coming from the mounts themselves rather than the characters. So to look at the Star Dragon, for example, you'll see the Princess here has 6450 for their attack and defense. And if you go to the Prince, it's only slightly higher. It's 6854. So they get 4 more attack and defense, but the weapon strength, the charge bonus, the armor, the HP, all of that is exactly the same. So in terms of combat, there isn't really too much between them. Princess has a mediocre range attack, which can still do something. Prince is going to be a little bit better in melee. The other main difference between them is their red line abilities here. So the Prince gets Rally and Stand Your Ground. The Princess, and actually the Archmage as well, which we'll see in a bit, gets this Loose ability. So starting off with the Prince, Rally is just a quick leadership AoE buff. And Stand Your Ground is basically the same thing, but also does melee defense. Now, the melee defense part of this is pretty nice, right? 24 is a solid increase, but everything else is kind of mediocre. First of all is the leadership. Generally isn't going to be a huge deal for the High Elves because they have very, very high base leadership already, especially once you're stacking experience and other things. I struggle to think of a situation when this would actually make a difference. And then on top of that, both of these effects are very short. So you can see Rally here is only 14 seconds, and Stand Your Ground is also 18 seconds. So in general, they're just not very high impact. They're not really going to do a whole lot. By comparison, the Princess gets Loose, which is a passive reload skill augment to all nearby allies, and it has a very nice effect range, 55 meters. And then Darken the Skies just buffs that up to +20 from +10. So on the surface, this would seem a lot better, especially with how much the High Elves, like their archers. But in reality, it can sometimes be a bit harder to use than you might think. Because if you think about it, right, with these lords, you're going to get a big flying terror-causing mount very early, right? Starting with the Griffin here at rank 14. And to use this buff, you still have to be pretty close to your ranged units. So do you really want your big giant, Star Dragon Lord, for example, to be sitting in the back on top of the archers just to give them a slight reload buff instead of getting in there, terror outing people, using breath attacks, stuff like that? Probably not. So This can maybe be a bit more useful if you have them, like especially earlier on, you have them like running along with some Reaver Archers or Shadow Warriors like out skirmishing to buff the reload. That can be okay. But in general, I think the opportunity cost of using this is pretty high, and it can be hard to reliably get a lot of use out of it. So overall, that's pretty much everything there is for the princes and the princesses. Again, not a whole lot in between them, and I think really it comes down to personal preference. Do you prefer the ranged option versus the slightly better melee? Going to the Archmage though, this is where things get interesting. And obviously the biggest difference is that they get magic. And this is particularly big for the High Elves, because the High Elves otherwise actually have very limited access to magic. If you look at their building chain, they actually need to get all the way to tier 4 to increase the capacity of their spellcasters. So the Lore Masters of Hoeth and the Mages. They don't unlock the Lore Masters until tier 4, and they only unlock the Mages at tier 3, but there's no capacity. So up until 4, you can only have one unit with a mage, one army, sorry, with a mage in it. Which means that if you want more than one army to have magic, until you have a tier 4 settlement, your only option is Archmages. And so that accessibility is pretty huge. Since magic is really powerful, getting it so much earlier is very nice. And then on top of that, the Archmages actually make much better spellcasters than your normal mages too. So the main thing is that they actually get flying mounts. So they can get Great Eagles and Moondragons, whereas normal mages normally are limited to steeds and chariots. I think there is one exception with fire mages. So for example, Imric's starting mage, they can actually get Sun Dragons. But other than that, for normal mages, you're limited to kind of being on the ground here, which is much worse than having a flying mount, because you can be a bit faster, a bit more flexible, get to where you need to be to cast spells. And normally, unless you have a fire mage, Archmages are your only option. So if you want to have a flying caster with anything other than fire magic, you can only get that with these guys. Then on top of that, their overall spellcasting potential itself is a lot higher because they get greater Arcane Conduit instead of just the normal one. So this will, with that spell mastery, this will buff all their damage up and all their effects in general up by 15% from their spells. They also get this bound spell in Chain Lightning, which is a pretty strong spell, and they get 2 uses. And then they can also further buff their cooldown and Winds of Magic cost. And this is also actually something that makes them a bit better than the Combat Lords, because they actually have these like unique abilities here, right? Whereas the princes or princesses just get the standard missile resist and spell resist, nothing special. And in fact, the Archmage is even slightly better here because they get all in one with ward save. So this will also help against magic attacks and things like that. One area where the Archmages are a bit worse off though is actually their mounts. So at first glance, they have a pretty similar selection overall, but they don't get Star Dragons, so they don't have quite a strong mount once they hit max level. More importantly than that, they get their mounts a lot slower than princes and princesses. So with the horse, remember, prince got it at rank 7, princess got it at rank 4. The Archmage has to wait until rank 11. They're going to be on foot until then, which is a pretty long time to wait. Then Chariot at 14, Great Eagle until 16, and they don't get the Moondragon until 22. And this is pretty huge because this is the first time, the first mount that'll give them Siege Attacker. Great Eagles don't have it. So Archmages have to wait until 22 for Siege Attacker, whereas the Prince and Princesses can get it at 14 with the Griffin. And that's also pretty big for the High Elves uniquely as well, because their only other options for Siege Attacker, if we look at the military chain, their only other options are the Bolt Thrower at tier 3. So it's fairly accessible, but these are honestly just kind of mediocre units. They're just not great artillery, especially compared to what other factions get. And then aside from them, your only other option for Siege Attacker are Dragons, which have the same problem as the Mages with, taking a really long time to get, right? You need a tier 4 settlement. So other than the mount situation, the Mages are obviously also a lot worse in combat, but this does equalize a bit once you get the Moondragon. Just like with the Princess versus Prince example, the large monstrous mounts sort of make up the difference. And so you can see here what the stats, right? 50, 44, 520. It's essentially the exact same as what the Princess gets. There's a bigger difference here with like the Eagle mounts, but once you get the Dragon, their baseline stats are essentially the same as the Princess. So that is pretty good there. But the problem is, because their stats are so crap until rank 22 when they get the Moondragon, or worse than the Combat Lords, there is a bit more of an opportunity cost for Archmages investing into the red and blue line instead of the yellow line. Because until, rank 22, and arguably maybe until rank 16, if you don't put any points in the yellow line, the Archmage is going to be useless on the battlefield. They have very poor combat stats and also no spells. Whereas the two Combat Lords start off with baseline stats that are solid, and they also get their mounts a lot faster. So even if you don't invest anything in their yellow line, they will still be able to contribute and help you fight in the battle. And this isn't a huge deal, but it does mean that the princes and princesses can potentially early on invest a bit more in the red and blue line without giving up so much of their combat capability, which means that their armies might be a bit better, and they also might perform a bit better on the campaign map than an archmage would be able to, just because they're able to invest a bit more. They have a bit more freedom to invest skills in these two lines. The last important thing to consider when comparing these different types of lords is the actual influence traits that they get. So of course with the high elves, whenever you're recruiting a lord, you have the option to spend influence to give them a certain trait, and the more influence you spend, the stronger that trait is. Now, generally this is also an area where I think the archmages fall behind slightly, because the traits they have available to them tend to be either individual buffs or like province-wide buffs, and are also usually kind of low impact. So for example, we'll just go through a few of them here. Protected, bit of resistant barrier, nice, but not massive. Administrator, again, just lowering construction cost for the local and time for the local province. But this usually isn't that impactful because your lords are normally going to be on the front line fighting. They're probably not going to be sticking around in provinces where you're doing a ton of construction. And then just to give you some other examples, Limber, again, just a speed buff, melee defense. This is pretty nice for getting around, but again, not a huge deal. And then there are also quite a few traits like this that will give certain spells to the mage. So if you're wondering, these can just be cast like normal. It gives you full access as if you had the spell, but they tend to not be so great because you can't actually put points into these to upgrade them like you can with spells of your own lore. So there's no way to, or you don't have as many options to lower the Winds of Magic cost, the miscast chance, the cooldown, and so on. So they tend to be a bit worse than just simply using spells of your own domain. And so it's like, okay, is having Glittering Robe, I don't know why it won't stick, but for example, is getting Glittering Robe on a life mage really that valuable when, you know, you can't reduce the cost or buff it at all, and you have other spells like Flesh of Stone or Shield of Thorns that you can use instead? I don't know, not really. We can look at a few more, but I think mostly you get the idea. It's all pretty similar to that. Same thing, you know, this like targeting range and miscast chance, it's nice, but also, you know, not a huge deal, especially for 60 influence. By comparison, princes and especially princesses can get some really strong traits that buff either their army or their overall performance on the campaign map. There are definitely some individual buffs like this, which, again, not a huge deal. But for example, with the prince here, Avaricious, this massively increases how much income you get from battles and also the magic item drop chance, which is pretty nice to have with how they've done the item rework now and where items are a lot stronger. And the reason I said princesses are a lot stronger strength is that they can get some buffs that massively help out ranged units. So for example, just with Retaliatory here, just a 15 influence trait, but it increases the missile strength of basically every ranged unit by 10%. And there's actually a better version of this, which also lowers enemy missile resistance. So if you look here, this is also just a standard combat buff, but energetic, again, 10% campaign movement range, the whole army getting speed and real-time reduction. These things are just a lot stronger than what the Archmage gets. So again, not a huge deal, but I do think princes and especially princesses tend to have better traits available. It is still a bit RNG, but normally you'll have some better options with the combat lords compared to the Archmage in terms of traits that you get. Now, all that being said, I do think in general, Archmages are probably the better lords. Just the much earlier accessibility to magic that they give you is really, really strong because magic is really, really strong. And the fact that they can become such good spellcasters with flying mounts is really, really nice to have. In terms of combat, of course, they do still end up with the dragon at the end of the day. So they can still be impactful in that regard as well, even if it's not quite as good as a princess or a prince. However, that does come with some caveats like the slower mount progression and the worse traits. So especially once you get later into the campaign where you have more built up settlements and you're able to get mages in all your armies because you have the unit cap, in that case, it can be a bit better potentially to use a prince or princess if you see a particularly good trait. Because again, some of these, like buffing the... Oh, this is the wrong one, sorry. But some of these, like buffing the missile strength of the whole army is really, really good. And if you have good mages anyways, sure, they're not going to be quite as good as the Archmage, but maybe this can lead to the army as a whole actually being stronger. So again, Archmages should generally probably be your bread and butter. But especially later on in the campaign, stay on the lookout for princes and princesses with particularly good traits, because that can actually make a huge difference. And if you do find a lord with a particularly good trait, you can actually go and save it using this button down here, and that'll allow you to load it into other campaigns, so you always have that available if you want to do that. Some people consider it a bit cheesy, but it is there if you want the option. So I hope all that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.